first time at REDCAT, and it's our pleasure, honor to bring up Robert Beavers.
Steve, you've been very kind to me, and yes, very, very kind. And I want to thank my other hosts. It is a pleasure to be again in Los Angeles, I think after 9 years. And now I have to bite the bullet and tell you that one of the films is missing from the program. So, Ute actually made the suggestion that I change the order. So I'm going to present first my most recent film, which is called Der Klang, die Welt, meaning sound, the world. We very quickly put an English translation of the spoken German text in the program, so you will find that. But the missing film is Picture of Colored Light. So we will go from Der Klang, die Welt to the Suppliant. Oh no, Amor, the Suppliant, listening to the space in my room, Among the Eucalyptuses, and again, I'll show you again the second time, Der Klang, die Welt. So I hope it'll be a good program, and we can have a chance to speak either in between films or at the end. Thank you very much.
I was going to ask you to just talk briefly, or as much as you want, about the relationship of the films in terms of the people. You had said in the notes that you came back. You filmed early, much earlier in time, people, and came back to the same space. Okay. And in the films that we're seeing tonight.
Not exactly.
Okay.
Not exactly. I lived with this couple, with Mr. and Mrs. Stählin, in a house outside of Zurich for 10 years. And so one film was my interest in how they lived, and both the difference, and I think the starting point was actually Mr. Stählin's daily practice on his cello. He was in his early 90s when I began to film him, and what it means to renew one's self for either performing or making something. So that was the starting point. And then my interest shifted to the ethical ground of Mrs. Stählin and how this informed the house and what it meant. In general, her being. And then the second film is in between the first and second film, her husband passed away, and I was no longer living in the house. Yes. But you were also the silent film, The Eucalyptuses, and the film that I did not show, Picture of Colored Light, which is a portrait of my own mother in her 80s. There is a continuity within the theme of the entire sequence of films, including The Suppliant, which was made in the apartment of a friend in Brooklyn, who had passed away, who, when I edited the sound, and he also had passed away. Yes. So that's a general idea.
All the films we saw tonight had Picture of Colored Light. The spaces of each film are so much central characters, you know. And I'm sure that this is something that you're that you're working with very intentionally. And in fact, some of your notes, I was seeing in Rebecca's, in the book on you, you talk about that. So is this something which is more of a focus and even departure from your earlier work? I mean, I know the Stella's, which we saw the other night, of course is about space. But in your 18-film cycle, is this something that is an ongoing central aspect of what you're concerned with in portraying?
I think the answer is yes. Because the title actually for the cycle is My Hand Outstretched to the Wing Distance and Sightless Measure. So that is the whole title. But having been a little bit worn out by the experience this evening, it would be helpful if I could turn the microphone and to the public. And I would be very happy to hear from anyone if they have a question or a comment. And if not, that's the problem.
Yes. Could you talk about your relationship, not only to music, but to poetry and literature? What is very pregnant in this film is that they are at the crossroads of many aesthetic interests. And so if you could talk more about the relationship to one of these art forms, for example.
Well, I think in these films to music and to measure, and that's perhaps why I liked very much the statement from Mr. Staley. He came. They are Swiss, and his background was partly anthroposophic, and so he is very concerned with measure and in relation to, of course, sound, but in general, as he says, also the unity of astronomy and music, this kind of idea. Of course, I think experimental filmmakers, or it's a bad term, but filmmakers who are outside of a normal production structure, that sometimes we nourish ourselves from points in the other arts. So I think that has been true from the beginning of my filmmaking, that there is this, one maybe constructs a communal sense of the arts because one is outside of the film world. And I think that's a rather important thing. I see this in also the filmmakers who were examples for me. That there was a generation in the 50s going into the 60s that were not allowed. There was no possibility for them to show the work very often, or sometimes also longer stretches of not making. And in those periods, then the other arts can become important. Yeah.
I was curious if you could talk about the extent to which you think about the audience when you're editing. Because I really enjoyed this. I've never seen your work before, and I really enjoyed myself. But I had I had a very strong sensation watching the images, that they were always being like pulled away from me, like a sort of peekaboo feeling. And I guess personally, I was curious whether that was intentional. But in general, I'm interested in the extent to which you think about the audience.
Well, I think I am. You can answer the kind of question in two ways. Either I'm thinking about the audience all the time, I could say that, and I could also say I'm not thinking about the audience at all. And both would probably be true.
Yeah.
I
I guess about effect, maybe.
The what?
Like the effect.
I think that is more, I would stand on the possibility that the audience grows towards me.
Yeah.
Rather than I do something for them on that level, because I obviously believe in the choices that I make, and I hope they are not self-indulgent. This would be maybe the border that I am trying to keep in mind, and so when you say peekaboo. I think that's more maybe a kind of rhythm or a sense of structure that is not familiar to you.
Exactly,
But when you see it again, other things merge, and that's where it might come towards the other arts, where maybe in this period when I was making that film, for instance, I was interested in certain American writers, like Elizabeth Bishop or Marion Moore. And when you read something like Marion Moore, who is using found material, it's also, it doesn't reach you immediately. And this is maybe also I think I said this the other evening, I am editing, and this comes to your question again, I'm editing over months, and sometimes a long period. I think listening may have taken me a year and a half to edit, and yet I'm expecting the spectator, you, to grasp it within the time that I'm allowing you.
Yeah.
And, that all of the rhymes within the image or the editing somehow are, and that's a musical, a poetic musical sense of how sensuously connected you are to sight and sound, and thinking with that, because we are in a culture that demands the dramatic and the literary, whereas our kind of filmmaking, the narrative is in the image itself, and when it's very difficult because the culture doesn't really present the possibility of developing the public that many opportunities, because it's always being told what to do. And that was the wonderful thing that came out of the free filmmakers of course, since I am American, I think of our outcast filmmakers who gave such freedom to the spectator, meaning the New American Cinema and others. So there was that wonderful moment where the seriousness that came after the Second World War joined with the humanism in cinema for a very hopeful situation. Yeah. Anyone else have some idea?
One thing you do, it seems in most of your films, is move the turret. And that's something I haven't seen that. I don't see it very often. Gregory did that as well, or is that something? No, he did. Okay. Well, so that's something that you kind of, as I see, kind of mastered. And it becomes part of the progression of the film, but also the way that the film feels sensually, and in terms of the way it reveals every image, But one is actually seeing that transition, but my experience is that it never feels self-conscious, or it never feels, how do I say, accidental, of course. You always are moving into something that feels very, very grounded and very connected. But I guess I'm commenting on just it as a musical, since you're bringing up that analogy, musical device. And it's amazing because it's like not easy to do, just physically, I think. But secondly, to be able to do it in a way that is integrated and becomes part of the vocabulary. I just think it's a fascinating and fabulous thing, actually. So that's more comment, but obviously something you develop very consciously early on with the films, right? Yeah. And something that also marks the films as 16, or you do it beautifully in the 35 film too, that we saw today.
Well, that's originally a 16 film. That's
Ooh.
really. Yes. I have almost never used a 35 millimeter camera.
So that's
yes, that's good.
Okay.
Someone asking had a question?
Front.
Yes. Great.
Hi. I was wondering if you could speak to the presence of hands in your films, because I think in all the films we saw tonight, hands are so central in the film. It was central in the Stoas from a couple nights ago, and it seems to me also thinking about you sort of physically editing the films together. I'm sure if you could comment on how hands sort of function in your films.
Yes. Well, for instance, in the Amor film, it is the guiding space in a way, because I'm trying to create the sound, editing of the sound in relation to the hands, and in, the palm of the hand and the back of the hand is what I'm using to sometimes to guide between sound and silence, and basically, I would say it is about the psychic. What may attract me is the psychic element around the hand. That the hand has an energy around it, and of course, it's also many of my films are involved with handcraft. And craft, the original, maybe the etymological, is strength, so that those two together, the psychic energy of the hand, and as a place for, of course, creation. Yes?
He was just thinking about motion side to side versus motion up and down. I felt like there was so much, even though the camera rarely turned, I felt myself turning the space relative to things a great deal in a very beautiful and moving way to me. But I'm curious if it feels like there's a different quality for this kind of motion and this kind of motion.
Well, I think maybe in these notes that are at the back, that are in the book, I was thinking about something. I used the term prismatic space, and trying to present, and for instance, also the hand, for instance, two sides of something. And in my notebook film also, I'm showing the two sides of the page, and there's a text that I wrote called Emblem, and there are images called emblematic images, which are also these paintings that are painted on both sides. And I found that interesting. You know, there's a famous one by, I think, Dürer or others, where you have, or Bosch. So this takes the image in a certain direction. And in this space, also because of the lens and my movement with the lens, this is connected. For instance, with Amor, my initial idea was to have it, I wouldn't say, I don't know what the word is, not echo, but be related to the movement of the eye. And so when you asked about the peekaboo, this turning of the lens and into, off the aperture, I was thinking of as in relation to the fact that we never move our eyes without closing them. In other words, you cannot, I think physically it's impossible for us to turn the eye, if you're looking at one thing and then you're looking at another thing, you always blink. And so I was thinking of this, for instance, when I was panning in this beautiful piazza, and the lens moves off. This was in some way related to my thought about the lens as the eye and the space where you don't see. And of course, film, the vitality of projection comes from the fact that it's half of the time the screen is black. So this, I think very much in my editing, I'm sometimes expanding this, you could say where there's no image, where I've turned the lens off, is like the space between, enlarging the space between the frame through the movement. Because in my films, I try to balance the static composed images, which is natural for my kind of editing, and the moving camera. And my camera movements are almost all done using a tripod, but it's these two things. I think for me that's important. Good. So, yes.
Question about ritual?
Because I'd like to leave you with some of your own thoughts also.
Okay.
So you don't have to give them to me.
Well, last question that I want to make, which is, or give you, is ritual, seems to be something that is embedded in the work, to varying degrees, in the sense of even as you're talking about the hand movements, and in the sense that there is a performative aspect of it, and so obviously it's not the same as just free-form gesturing, but I think that weaves through the films, and then you have some films where you're actually performing gestures which seem much more ritualistic. So I'm just wondering about that and how you relate that. First of all, that's something that came out more in your years of having lived in Europe, for some reason, and is how that seems to come and go, in all the work. And ritual may not be the best word, but it is something about the gesture, signifying, I guess. So is that something that resonates or means something that you can say anything about? Because it's fascinating to me. It's somewhere between natural and not, but also very meaningful. Right. So the way it integrates in terms of the other kinds of movement is fascinating.
I think I will need some time to think about that.
Okay. Fair enough. Okay. I guess that may be unless someone else has a question. Anyone else would like to ask? Sure.
Yeah, I want to go back to the question of editing and connect it to the question of the collect of the images. Do you shoot for a film with the film in mind? Or do you have...
You don't have to go further.
The reservoir...
Bernice, you don't have to go further.
Yeah.
It's the first.
It's the first.
Yes. Always.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, well, yeah, we have another question. Yeah.
Hi, I actually wanted to ask you about color in your films, because I did watch, or I did have the opportunity to see Picture Colored Light 10 years ago, and the memory that I have of it is this stupendous color in that film. But the films that you streamed tonight also have just such vibrant color. So I wonder if you could talk about that, perhaps in relation to the kinds of rhythm that you're able to achieve both within the shot through movement and within the editing, because I think there's a kind of vibrancy of color and rhythm that's going on within the shots as well. So.
Right, thank you. Since it may be something just this evening, but I really connected to the question about the hands, because the gap between a film that I made called The Ground, which ended the cycle of 18 films, and it coincided with Gregory Macropoulos' death. And then I took, I think, 4 years to film Picture, and what you are speaking about was central to what I was trying to reach. So it became very important for me, I don't know if I should call it value or the psychic strengths of color, and so I tried to reach that, and in living spaces. So Steve was not completely wrong in naming the program, because these living spaces became, they're almost all the films are living spaces except for the silent film. And so color, the language of color, which had been very important at the beginning of my filmmaking, where I placed colored filters. I tried to well, for the people who saw the notebook, you know I placed filters in the camera, and I was very interested in a kind of abstract color, or coming maybe also from the American moment of color. But when I went back to color, and there had been some years where it had sort of drifted, what was in the background, but then when I came back to a conscious sense of how important color was for me with the filming in Massachusetts, then I can't think right now what my, it's difficult to go back into that moment, only I know that what you're saying is exactly correct.
All right. Okay, well, maybe on that note, thank you, Robert. Thank you for